is a first-time author, David Allon, author of the book Oranges to Easels. We're honored to have him and his wife with us this morning. Oranges to Easels is a fascinating story of David's father, who at the age of 21 arrived from Eastern Europe at the port of Jaffa in 1935. Together with many other immigrants, he helped build the state of Israel with his own unique contributions. The book presents a sweeping panorama of his journey from Eastern Europe to Palestine under British mandate and its subsequent transformation into the Jewish state of Israel. David tells the story of his father, and in researching his father's past, became a tenacious detective and assembled a complex mosaic of sources to understand the enigma of his own father. No doubt, you will be compelled to obtain your own copy of the book, and books will be available right after the program for purchase right here, and David will be happy to autograph personally each one. David was born in Israel. He grew up in Ramat HaSharon, just north of Tel Aviv, during Israel's first decades. He attended the Walworth Barber American International School in Kfar Shmaryahu. He continued his studies at Brandeis University, the London School of Economics, and Columbia Business School in New York. He works in the finance and economics field, and together with his wife and family, they live in Wayne. Please join me in welcoming David Allon.
I want to thank Rob and the Men's Club for inviting me to speak today. And I want to congratulate Roy on his Man of the Year award. It's wonderful. This is a great temple. Closer. Thank you. I'm sorry. Should I start again? Thank you. Excellent. This is a wonderful temple. I have several friends here who thank you so much for attending. I also learned this morning that my wife's bat mitzvah, my wife went to temple Bet Tefillah, and her plaque from her bat mitzvah is up in your
My confirmation picture.
Sorry. It's a better picture. No. So, what I want to do is talk briefly about the book, Oranges to Easels, and then I'll read 3 segments from the book, and then we'll open up to questions. Let me get started. My father was born in 1914 in Białystok, Poland. Białystok, Poland was typical of other towns in Białystok, in Poland. Population not close enough. I'm good. I don't know. So my dad was born in 1914 in Białystok, Poland. Białystok is typical of a lot of Polish cities. Jewish population was very vibrant. In fact, a survey from 1894 shows that Białystok, 80,000 population, was almost 2/3 Jewish. Culture, Jewish studies, synagogues, Yiddish papers were very common there. However, my father's father, Elchanan Pickholz, was not born there. He was born in Patlov, Ukraine. Patlov was interesting because it was about 10% Jewish, but also a very strong faction of Cossacks. Anti-Semitism was prevalent there. In 1905, both my father's parents were murdered in a major pogrom where hundreds were killed. And 17-year-old Elchanan decided to move on to Bialystok, about 600 miles away. He met his future wife and basically opened a haberdashery. He lived a few blocks from the haberdashery, but around the corner from the synagogue. I think actually life in Bialystok was pretty idyllic in 1914 to 1925, let's say. Jewish life was very good. My father attended Cheder for 8 years, and after Cheder, he was a very, very, very good student. Went to the Drushkin Gymnasium, which is a German-style education system, very heavy on the, not as much about the Jewish studies, very heavy about economics, social studies, and Latin. He learned Latin for 4 years and was very fluent in it. The other benefit for growing up in Bialystok is that he was fluent in 5 languages before he was 18, right? Yiddish, Hebrew, which he learned at home and in the synagogue, Polish, and Russian. Russian because the Russians used to come in, win a war, and the next day Russian was spoken in the schools. And 2 years later the Poles would come in, and as of the next morning, Polish was spoken in the schools. So I see a few nods. This is typical in Eastern Europe. And then Latin. And also there's a ophthalmologist called Ellel Zamenhof who invented Esperanto. And when my dad, this is in the late 20s, and his friends were just trying to kind of, I guess, study some more, they decided to learn Esperanto. I discuss it more in the book, so I won't go into more details about it, but Esperanto is a utopian language with the thought that maybe a common language would unite Europe. My dad was 18, he and his best friend Misha went to Prague, Czechoslovakia to attend medical school. Prague was a very cosmopolitan city in the early 30s. The university where he attended, Stefan Batory University Charles University was founded in the 12th century, one of the oldest universities in the world. And medical school was fine until he had to autopsy his first body. And he fainted. So this was not going to be his career. He handled it pretty well, and he applied to Stefan Batory University in Vilnius, where he went to law school and studied economics and social studies. So when he went to Vilnius also was probably the most authentic Jewish city. In fact, Jews have been living there in very peaceful coexistence for about 600 years. And one of the biggest rabbis in Europe, the Gaon Gadol, who is renowned, many yeshivas are there, many Yiddish newspapers, huge amount of culture was there. In fact, when Napoleon visited there in 1810, he was amazed at the amount of Jewish culture that was going there. He called it the Jerusalem of the North, which is an interesting kind of anecdote. So my father attended law school, and around 1934, he invited one of his girlfriends from high school to visit him from Bialystok to hear a very renowned professor speak at the university. There's a big auditorium, there's about 100 students, 10 of them were Jewish. You have to understand, in the 30s, if you're Jewish and you're in the university, you sat in the back row. Professors never called on you unless the rest of the students could not answer the question. There was overt and covert anti-Semitism throughout Europe at that time. The lecture started, and about halfway through the lecture, 8 or 9 hoodlums walked into the room. They told the Christians to leave, and they started beating up the Jewish students with sticks. And my father and the others were beat up, and he tried to protect his girlfriend at the time. But that was a seminal moment where he decided at age 21 that there's no future for him in Europe. He wanted to go to Palestine. And what I will tell you, if you go back to 1925, it was another seminal moment. He was 11 years old. His father came back from a business trip by train from Warsaw to Bialystok, and he was beat up, bleeding from his head. He would come home, and his kids saw him there. And that moment reminded the Jews these type of moments remind the Jews that, living in Poland was in a good sense kind of much better than living in Spain or in Britain, where you were thrown out during the Inquisition and when the British threw out the Jews as well. And yet you're still 1 minute away, you're 1 day away from a pogrom, you're 1 day away from violence. And that's when my dad decided to move to Palestine. He went back home to Bialystok, told his parents, who thought he was basically irrational. You're going to be a lawyer, you can have a very good business, very good middle class life in Poland. You're very educated, and Palestine has what? Malaria, deserts, poverty. The depression was everywhere, so Palestine couldn't be any better. But nonetheless, he and his second best friend, Shaiki, decided to leave, and they boarded train after train from Bialystok to Warsaw, from Warsaw to Vienna. From Vienna, they went on Orient Express, but they were not in first class, they were like in fourth class. They got to Istanbul, they jumped on a boat, and they reached Jaffa, the shores of Jaffa, on October 28, 1935. So the decision for Aliyah was also because in his college years, he and his friends were reading Theodor Herzl. And when you read Theodor Herzl and you're living in Europe, you realize there's not a good future going to happen over here. My father landed in Israel, and that's really the last time he saw his parents. Him and most of their family were annihilated by the Nazis. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about what Palestine was like in 1935. So the Depression was happening all over the world. Unemployment was quite high. Finding a job was difficult. So my father had two friends at that point in Palestine: his friend Shaiki and his first cousin Batsheva Weinstein. Batsheva said to him in Tel Aviv, you need to go to the U.S. the British Post Office. If you recall, the British mandate ran everything there: the post office, the police force, the prisons, the railroads. They ran everything. So if you could get a job, a bureaucrat job with the British, you were probably set. Not financially, let's say, but you would have a job. He went to the post office, filled out a form. The officer looked over the form and said, "Yeah, this guy's pretty educated. You're hired." He said, "Let me come back tomorrow morning." And he came back the next morning, and against his first cousin's wishes, he said, "You know what? I don't want to join the post office because you have one caveat in this employment form. I need to be here for 3 years. And I'm not going to be willing. I didn't come to Palestine to sign my life away, to be here for 3 years, making £4 a month, with no opportunity to go else and build big opportunities." And the reason he wanted big opportunities was he wanted to send a third of his income to his parents in Bialystok for two reasons. Number one, to help them survive economically, but number two, to show them that they should follow in his footsteps and come to Palestine. So the next day he opened the 3 Israeli papers, Haaretz, Ma'ariv, and Yediot Achronot. He looked at the want ads, and he went to his first interview the next Friday. He went to the first interview with a company called Orange Syndicate. And these are, if you could move the slides a little bit. Thank you. So I want to show this slide again. This is 1929. My dad is here, and he's 15. This is Elchanan, this is Rosa, and this is Moshe. Again, he would never see his parents once he left. And he saw his brother one more time. You'll see it in the book. So orange groves. You have to put yourself back in the 1930s. Oranges were the biggest exporter of Palestine at the time, right? If you look from 1925 to 1935, there's the Jewish-owned orange groves. It went from about 10,000 dunam to 140,000 dunam within a decade. The Arab groves also went from 20,000 dunam to 140 dunam within 10 years. This was like the boom of Silicon Valley here. If you could collect oranges, we're really very simple. You planted seeds, you harvested the oranges, you shipped them mostly to England, France, and Germany, believe it or not, in the 30s was still buying oranges from Palestine. It was a good business. So the Orange Syndicate basically was a collective, and they purchased the oranges from the Arab and the Jewish villages, but they also provided packing, sorting, financing, and shipping and marketing into Europe. So his first interview with Isaac Rokach, who was a co-partner in the Orange Syndicate, it was about a 2-hour interview. And Isaac wanted to kind of figure out, who is this young man? You know, was he mature enough? Was he educated enough? What's his family background like? And more importantly, why did he come to Palestine? That fifth Aliyah from 1933 to 1937, 177,000 Jews came to Palestine. But this is a very different Aliyah from the first 4. The first 4 were real pioneers. And then basically, Isaac wanted to figure out what was going on. So they spoke in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish. And after the meeting, Isaac was very happy and said, you know what, I'm going to give you the job. You're going to be the only Jew in 4 Arab villages. You're going to be the foreman to organize the work teams, purchase the oranges, and then we'll sort them and pack them and ship them overseas. Mordecai now is a lawyer, if you recall. And he said, let me think about it for the weekend. I'll be back in your office Monday at 8 a.m., tell you the answer. He was obviously elated. The pay was 11 pounds sterling per month. Now the reason was that because it was battle pay. You were going to be the only Jew in 4 Arab villages living in a 1-room hut with no water, so obviously no bathrooms, and no electricity. So it was kind of like battle pay. He went home, he thought about it, then he went out to party at Disney Gulf Circle, and he told pretty much, everyone he met, hey, I got this great job, I'm going to make a ton of money, and he was pretty happy until he stepped into the guy's office Monday morning, and the guy pulled him into his office and said, that was a really foolish thing to do. That was really immature, because what happened, Israel only has 300,000 Jews in the whole country. And you spoke to 5 or 6 people, word got back to my lazy brother, and he came to me during the week and said, I want this job. How can you give this to a stranger? So now that my father was admonished, he kind of was humbled, and he said, nonetheless, Isaac Rokach passed him the contract, and I still have a copy of that contract from November 6, 1935, which my father gave me, and I cherish it. So let me read a segment first from the book, and this segment is about the orange groves. This is the first day in the orange groves. Supervising orange groves. When Mordecai stepped into his first orange grove, he entered yet another new world. Long rows of orange trees, dressed with lush green leaves and bearing countless unripe green oranges. Located 14 miles from the south, the Yavne area looked nothing like Tel Aviv. Mordecai wore a brown hat to protect his eyes from the warm sun. He looked down at the deep brown soil, later to learn that the fertile soil is called Hamra in Arabic. He looked up at the sky, blue from end to end, not a cloud in sight. He took a deep breath and wondered, what would the next week look like? How would he fare as the only Jew in 4 Arab villages? Would they like him, respect him, take him seriously as a manager, or shun him for lack of any scintilla of experience in cultivating citrus in the Palestinian soil? But now was not time for self-doubt. It was time to learn Arabic, his 6th language. Mordecai grabbed his knapsack and started walking down the dusty paths between the orange groves. A barefoot boy not a day over 7 followed him curiously. Mordecai motioned with his finger for the boy to come closer. My name is Mordecai, he said hesitantly in Hebrew. I am new here. The boy shook his head. Salam, he greeted the stranger in Arabic. Mordecai pulled out a package of candies in colorful wrappers from his knapsack. He pointed to a nearby tree, and the boy looked at the tree, then back at Mordecai, who was still pointing. The boy smiled and said, and was thinking, who doesn't like sweets? The boy said, Abuja. Then Mordecai pointed to an orange, and the boy smirked and said, Saraja. As Mordecai reached out to give the boy another sweet, the boy pointed to himself and said, Ahmad. Mordecai knew his young teacher's name. Mordecai, all of 21, hardly a family man, felt a twinge of nostalgia. He thought of his brother Moshe, who was now 14. He hadn't seen him since leaving Poland. Every evening at candlelight, Mordecai transliterated a list of Arab words he had learned that day from children and adults. He was the only Jew in the 4 villages, and he lived in a one-room dwelling without electricity or a bathroom. He used his basic Arabic to begin to establish rapport with each of the village muftis. In turn, they would help him organize work teams for the orange groves, a team for maintaining the trees, a team for picking the oranges, and a team for sorting and packing the fruit for export. Mordecai spent the next 6 months managing the cultivation and harvesting of oranges. That was only half of it. Language and culture barriers made his position more difficult, at times unsafe. Certainly his compensation was ample, but in a sense it was also danger pay. If the Isaac Rokoch's word about confidentiality hadn't dented the young man's cockiness, the realities of his job did. Mordecai reasoned that a bit of danger was a Zionist way. You left the diaspora and its economic advantages and comforts because you believed in the concept of the Jewish people determining their own fate. And you understood from the start that there would be challenges helping to achieve the Zionist dream of the Jewish homeland. So my father worked for Orange Syndicate for 3 years, and he learned a lot, both on the ground in terms of dealing with people, but more importantly from Isaac Rokoch. Isaac was a very established business person, very highly respected. His father was immigrated back in 1900. His grandfather, his son would be the mayor of Tel Aviv eventually. But guess what? September 1939 happened, World War II started, and the shipping lanes were closed. Commercial traffic stopped, and the Orange Syndicate basically had to shut down. Very much like happened 2 years ago to us here, right? If you can't ship the oranges, you can't sell the oranges. Well, the nice thing about the job that my dad had was you worked for 8 months a year, and then 4 months a year, it was like a teacher essentially. You were off, and he spent 4 months a year in Tel Aviv learning the culture, understanding the economy, figuring out, what the country's about. And he, again, thinking with a legal mind, thinking as an economist, he realized that there was only one future for him. He had to cater, he had to do business with the British mandate. 1939 started, World War II came with full force, and the fact of the matter is, strategically speaking, Palestine was the throughway between Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia. The British built up the bases. Airport was expanded once and once and once. Even the Americans had an air base there. Not an air base, they had a platoon of planes there. So he opened a catering business, and now he had to learn his next language, which was English. But knowing Latin, you can move to English pretty fast. And the British officers appreciate his yekiness, his ability to be a man of honor and do good work for them. Everything goes well to 1942, and then his old friend Shaiki, who he came by boat with, who at this time had already joined the Haganah and became a mid-level lieutenant there, said, look, we're going to tap you. We need some of your sources. We need some of your skill set. So the first thing was the British, as you know, were far away from home, and the officers loved a little scotch. And as a caterer, he had the ability of buying scotch and providing the scotch to the British officers at their parties or celebrations. In return for that scotch, he didn't want payment. He wanted arms. He wanted some of the British officers to smuggle arms, to give him arms that he could smuggle back to the Haganah. In 1942 and 43, he was sent by the Haganah for missions to Iraq and Iran. I won't go into detail, it's in the book. He did speak fluent Arabic. There are different dialects, but he did speak fluent Arabic, and I mentioned in the book. I will say quickly that the last time he met his brother Moshe, if you could go to the next slide, was in Tehran. Moshe had escaped to the Russian front, other way. And Moshe was a airplane engineer in Tehran, and that's the last time the two of them met. My father never knew really what happened to Moshe till around 1995 when he paid a researcher to figure it out. What I want to do is read you a second segment, and just to give you a sense of what's, to give you some background. Sorry about that. At this point, 1947, Ben-Gurion and all his lieutenants realized what was happening. The mandate, World War II is over, the mandate's, we're going to have to do something. We need to do whatever we can with the United Nations. At this point, in early 1947, the UN has developed the UN Partition Committee, and Ben-Gurion sent Abba Eban to be the ambassador of Palestine. I won't get the legal terms of it, but basically, Ben-Gurion wanted to do everything he could. He was a real visionary. I mean, we all know Ben-Gurion. He was, the George Washington, the Alexander Hamilton, and an amazing leader with vision, even though he was a very small man, actually. So let me read you the second segment, and this is about my father on his first mission to the United States. Visiting the New World. Mordecai's first trip to New York departed Lydda, Palestine, June 26, 1947, less than 1 year after TWA inaugurated civilian transatlantic route. Crossing the Atlantic in 1947 was an exhausting ordeal. The DC-3 was was a very successful propeller airplane at the time. 20 passengers flew at 220 miles an hour. Unfortunately, the DC-3 had to be refueled frequently, and the crew required multiple rest stops. Mordecai flew from Palestine to Athens, Athens to Paris, Paris to London, London to Ireland, Ireland to Gander, Newfoundland, and 3 days after his trip began, Mordecai arrived in New York's Marine Air Terminal, the present site of LaGuardia Airport. On the American side of the Atlantic, Seymour and Celia Weinstein, again, these are his first cousins from Bialystok. They had left in the early 1900s, along with their 2 children and 12 other relatives, were actually looking forward to seeing Mordecai. Seymour hadn't seen his Mordecai since Bialystok when Mordecai was a teenager. Memories of those who perished in the hands of the Nazi executioners remained. However, this day in New York was one of nearly pure joy. The Weinstein family arrived at the airport 2 in the morning. They were an hour early. The flight, of course, was 2 hours late. Nothing could dim their excitement. Just a few years after the Holocaust annihilated entire Jewish communities, including the 4 Seymour siblings and his mother, meeting a long-lost relative felt immeasurably precious. So, when Mordecai finally emerged from customs, he looked nothing like the relatives imagined. They envisioned a pale, observant Jew wearing European clothing. Instead, Mordecai's body was bronzed from the desert sun. He wore a t-shirt with a cigarette box rolled in his left sleeve. Unexpectedly, but it didn't matter. The Weinsteins greeted Mordecai with blessings and tears. On the walk to their car, Celia asked Mordecai if he wanted to eat. Well, Mordecai was famished after that long trip. And he responded, "Yes, I would. What do you like to eat? Bacon and eggs, please." Seymour and Celia stopped in astonishment. Pork and shellfish had never passed their lips. From Poland to America, they held on to the Jewish identity through customs and prayer. They kept a kosher home, went to synagogue every Saturday, and provided their children with a Jewish education. Mordecai, at least at that point of his life, did exactly none of those. From Poland to Palestine, he held on to his Jewish identity through Zionism, the struggle for the Jewish state. Mordecai's experience at British military bases had clearly influenced his eating habits. So the mission was 6 months. It was completely covert because if you recall, there was a complete arms embargo by President Truman, right, of Palestine and the whole Middle East. After World War II, nobody wanted to get another military involvement. So let me skip further to this is the last segment I want to read, and then we'll take questions. The principal reason for Mordecai's travel to the United States in 1947, and again in 1948, each time for 6 months, was to conduct missions for the Jewish Agency. Again, fluency in languages proved very helpful. The most critical mission for the first trip to New York centered on the United Nations partition vote. Set for May 14, 1948, leaders of the emerging Jewish state were focused and trying to get a successful vote for the Palestinian partition from the 56 voting members of the UN. Successful passage required 2/3 majority. With 5 minutes to go before the vote, it was crucial to influence the outcome of establishing a Jewish state. Among the people Mordecai courted was Guatemala's delegate to the United Nations, Jose Granados. Ambassador Granados came from a long line of political leaders. His grandfather was president of Guatemala. The ambassador was a key player in the vote to create Israel, having been appointed in early 1947 to the UN Partition Committee. And this committee job was to resolve what had become a seemingly intractable problem, a situation that led them to send a delegation of 8 members for 16 days to Palestine to speak to all sides of the issue, and to figure out whether partition made sense and how to delineate the lines. In the course, the UN committee, fact-finding committee to Palestine, Granados and his fellow members spoke to all parties, including the British Mandate, Arab leaders of Jerusalem and Transjordan, and the Jewish officials in Palestine. During this trip and back in New York, many Jewish leaders pleaded for the founding of the Jewish state. The Balfour Declaration in 1927 was a seminal statement of British support for the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people. It was penned in a letter from Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, to Baron Rothschild, the leader of the British Jewry. This weighty letter led the groundwork for continued creating a country for the Jewish population. In words and in actions, the Jewish underground had fought the Arabs and the British Mandate. Abba Eban was a lead emissary to the United Nations from the Jewish Agency. Eban was well-spoken, if stuffy, South African-born Zionist. He had studied at Cambridge. Eban gave very inspiring speeches at the UN and to many American Jewry and to the American Jewry community. Yet he was less successful in persuading members of the United Nations. Maybe it was his British accent, a subtle turnoff to ambassadors to the UN from many third world nations. Perhaps it was Eban's professorial style, which was more pompous than relationship building fellowship. Ben-Gurion was a very exceptionally pragmatic politician. He wanted to win the UN vote for partition. As cables arrived in Tel Aviv from Abba Eban, Ben-Gurion was not that confident that Abba Eban could close the deal. He thus sent several emissaries to try their hand at persuasion and charm, and Mordecai was one of those. He was explicitly assigned to deal with Granados. Granados was a devout Catholic. Both Granados and Eban thought very highly of themselves. It actually worked much better that Mordecai had endured anti-Semitism and persecution growing up in Poland, and then immigrated to Palestine to work in the orange groves. Ben-Gurion saw Mordecai as a reliable, driven Zionist who would do whatever the Jewish Agency told him to do. Mordecai had a gift of language and persuasion, and it was obvious to Ben-Gurion and his lieutenants. Through English and broken Spanish, Mordecai developed his relationship with Ambassador Granados. He couldn't relate to Granados' devout Catholicism, but his storytelling was universal. Granados learned about anti-Semitism Mordecai had endured in Bialystok, in Prague, and in Vilnius. He learned that Jews and Arabs once worked together to provide oranges for much of Europe. And he learned that it was like to literally serve British military officers, imperialists, who didn't belong in the Jewish homeland. In the end, it wasn't really Mordecai's intelligence, but his ability to connect on a personal level, that it was his unique gift. Granados was moved by his service on the committee, on the UN committee, and all the accounts he heard from Mordecai and others. Not only did Guatemala vote for the partition of Palestine in 1947, but President of Guatemala, Arvelo, helped influence Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama to also vote for partition. Granados even published a book detailing how he came to his decision, The Birth of Israel, the drama as I saw it. Granados had a significant role in the final outcome that led to the Declaration of Independence of Israel in May 14, 1948. The warm ties between Guatemala and Israel even last to the present day. Mordecai returned to Tel Aviv soon after the UN vote. Mission accomplished, he had done his small part to help in the foundation of the Jewish state. So, why don't we open up to questions? Thank you very much.
First of all, let's
My friend?
Good to see you here. What were the mechanics of you learning all this? Was it face-to-face?
Thank you for that great question. My dad passed away in 2003, and I was very close to my dad for 44 years. I will tell you the start of this was from age 5 till I left Israel at age 16. My dad and I walked in the orange groves of Ramat HaSharon every Saturday, right? As typical in Israel, you work 6 days a week. On Saturday, my dad and I walked, and he gave me the oral history. In his words, what it was like to grow up in Bialystok, what his parents were like, what Prague was, what Vilnius was like, what Tel Aviv was like. So the oral history was the basis of the book. But more than that, my dad hand wrote letters to his in-laws in Brooklyn for 50 years. And my grandmother saved each one of those letters and gave them to me a few years before she passed away. So I had 2 long boxes, 400 to 450 letters, which I read each one of them probably 3 times. The third source is letters that my dad wrote to me and my siblings. And the fourth source was a lot of sleuthing, some research. I'll give you one quick story. So you guys probably know one of the teachers in Or Shalom in my synagogue was Asaf from Moravsky. I assume some of you know Asaf. Asaf and I are pretty good friends. We do lunch about twice a year. And I was speaking to Asaf probably 10 years ago, and he said, you really should speak to the retired curator of the Haganah Museum. I said, sure. He said, you got to hurry up because he's, very advanced age. But he encapsulates a lot of knowledge there. So I reached out to him by email, and then we spoke. And I said, just trying to confirm some of these stories, did you know a guy called Mordecai Allon? He's thinking. He said, yeah, I knew 2 of these guys, Mordecai Allon. I said, okay, who's the first guy? The first guy was a pilot in the fledgling Air Force, but he was shot down. I said, that can't be my father, because I wouldn't be here. And then he mentioned that he knew Mordecai Allon, the other one who went on missions to the United Nations, to the US. So the research was really complicated because my father was an enigma, right? I mean, he, in addition to all the story you've heard so far, he had a very, a very interesting and successful business life in Israel in 3 different sectors. He was very active in the community, Rotarian for 40 years, etc. But he was an enigma because, in a sense, he never wanted to talk about the Holocaust. He never wanted to talk publicly and exhibit emotions publicly. It's a matter of trying to figure out the enigma after he passed away. Anyway, thank you. Yes, please.
So when your father came to this country, he faced a kind of culture gap with his American relatives.
Yes.
Not
The fact that he ate pork and
not,
yeah.
not seeing our religion the same way. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, he did. I think what I will say is that, Bialystok, most towns in Poland, no matter where the immigrants went, to the US, to Australia, to Mexico, to Palestine or Israel, there's a certain brotherhood that they did get along and respect each other. I mean, obviously they hosted him for 6 months in their own house. As you will go back in this book, and if we can play some more pictures here, my dad actually met my mom on his second mission. And that's my mom in 1949. So he met her, and it's a great story.
David's first date story.
It's my first date story, and apparently she was persuaded. But I mean, the story, I don't want to I want to do justice, but basically, my dad went on a blind date. It was a double blind date, essentially. And he met my mother, Geraldine, who was a product of Erasmus High School, Hunter University, and Columbia Teaching College. So there was, she came from a very, I don't know what to call it, good Jewish family, I guess. But it was love at first sight. There's a chapter I called Tavern on the Green. It's like 10 pages long, so I'm not going to read it to you. I don't want you to fall asleep.
Thank you.
Gary?
So you had to do all this research. I'm just curious, does Israel have anything
where they track or name people that have served Israel, including the state of Israel? It sounds like your dad did, but there's lots of people who didn't officially serve in the military or were not listed in their in Mossad or Haganah. So there must be some way that Israel acknowledges people that have helped shape the state, but it sounds like there isn't. You're going to do this all.
Right, so let me try and respond the best I can. First of all, when I spoke to the curator of Haganah, everything in Israel is under seal. Okay? There's no FIF, there's no Freedom of Information Act in Israel. It's a secret forever. If you disclose information of a mission in the 30s, 40s, 50s, if you disclose anything about the Dimona nuclear reactor, you go to jail. Okay? As we know some people have. So the short answer is, I don't think these are the unsung heroes. And I think at the end of the day, it's hard to make an assessment because I'm sure that there are hundreds of pioneers in the 40s who were involved in smuggling arms from Czechoslovakia, which is a big source, of bringing, the Jews from the flying carpet from Iraq and Yemen. But these are unsung heroes. The ones that are in the storybooks are Eli Cohen, because he passed away. So it's just that's my understanding from the lack of the freedom of information. There's no release after 20 years or 30 years. Yes, please.
What were the circumstances of your family coming to the United States?
Right. So my father never left Israel. Right. So my father, how can I say, it was in his fiber. He came to Israel, he was a pioneer, and he never lived in the United States. He came here on missions, he came here to visit his in-laws, and actually my grandparents, if you can move another picture maybe, my grandparents came to Israel every Passover for 3 weeks for like 50 years. I came on my own when I was 16. My parents stayed in Israel. Sorry. Yes, please.
Yes, there was any information of how many pickles.
Yes.
Is that in relation to the rabbi?
Right.
Is that the family?
So Pickles is a good story. My sister did genealogy work for over 20 years, and there are over 1,000 Pickleses alive. Well, I would say 20 years ago that were alive. It's a pretty, I don't know if it's a common name, but it was definitely. So there's a Pickles website of genealogy. I'm not sure if they're related directly. I know there's a Pickles in Pittsburgh I spoke to, and there's Pickleses in Israel. I really don't know if they're related or not. I will, just to address that a little bit more, I have a letter which my father wrote to my mom's maternal grandfather, explained to him in 1949 why he changed his name from Pickles to Allon. That's part of the type of letters I have in my collection. Sure. Any questions on this side? Yeah?
Yeah, I have many, many questions, but I'm just going to ask two now. And one is about the change. Your father changed his name. Can you give us any?
Sure.
We understand it's very common for
Sure.
Eastern Europeans when they come to Israel to take on a name.
Right.
I know a family they loved the Negev. They took on the name Negev as their last
Right.
name. But so, what can you tell us about the name change?
Right, so I covered in the book, obviously, I covered that letter, segments of it. Basically, I think that when my mom got married, they got married in March 20th, 1949. The honeymoon was a 17-day trip on a Liberty ship to the Middle East, to Palestine. And they penned a letter to explain to Goldstein, the maternal grandfather, why he changed the name. And the reason he said he wanted to change the name is Israel's a new start. And a lot of people, changed their name in the 40s. I think Ben-Gurion himself has come on record and said, we're a new nation. We can't have names. Well, he didn't say we can't have names, but we should put away our European past, and we should find names from the Bible, from nature, whether it's animals or plants. Allon is oak tree, as many people know. Many names like in Hebrew are like Aryeh for lion. beautiful flowers and plants. So it's pretty common that the population changed their name in the 40s, a couple of years after they arrived in Israel and Palestine. Second question.
Well, a quickie is what kibbutz did they live on? Or did they live on?
I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. Can you move on to other slides, please?
There's only art, Dave.
That's fine. That's me and that's my father giving me my first haircut. No,
That's you.
keep it. Obviously, it got effect.
There you go.
So my father was 44 years old when I was born. One thing you'll learn in the book that this marriage to Geraldine was a second marriage, and I covered it in the book briefly. But this is my first haircut. Okay, let's move on. As I mentioned earlier, or maybe I didn't mention, my father retired from business in 1979, and from 1979 till the end of his life, he was an artist. He apprenticed with Moshe Rosentalis in Jaffa for 8 years, and then he went on his own to have art. So this is probably his most well-known artwork. It's called Majum Tzfat. I don't know if there's any art collectors or connoisseurs here. Okay, but I mean, just to address this, maybe I should take the microphone. Just to address this picture, the reason I like it a lot, and it actually hangs both in our synagogue and also at Kesher Israel in Westchester. Sorry, there's a lot of symbolism here. So Kabbalah, right? We've all heard of Kabbalah. Kabbalah, this red, this force of red is a very Kabbalah color. You know, Madonna, has her little strings there, but this is before Madonna. Kabbalah has been around for hundreds, thousands of years. The symbolism here is this is Tzfat, and Tzfat, you have the fields here, you have the green fields, you have the old structures of Tzfat, which looks like Jaffa, if you've been there. You have God sending down the Israeli alphabet, and then you have some symbolism here of the ark, the Torah here, and you have a rabbi davening here, and it's very abstract, obviously. So this is one of my favorite paintings that he did. He was a very active artist. He did a lot of. He was basically colorist expressionist. If you go to the next painting, so this is didn't capture it, but this is 1984 rendition of Jerusalem. Next, this is him painting into his 80s on the Mediterranean. Just like the rest of his life, he was passionate about what he did. And this is the cover of the book. This is Panorama Tzfat. It's again very colorist, expressionist. It's not like a realistic rendition of Tzfat. It's more a feeling that it gave him to do. And I think there might be one more.
I don't think so.
Okay. So you have another one.
Yeah, so David, was he involved at all in the formation of the Israeli Air Force? Because we saw Nancy Spielberg created a documentary called, I don't know, I forget what the title was, but the details how the Israeli Air Force was formed, mainly U.S. fighter pilots. When after World War II wanted to get back in the action, but all of the planes were German surplus Messerschmitts that came from Czechoslovakia. And he said there was a connection.
The only connection was he was a passenger at different flights, but he was never a pilot.
Yeah, okay. Well, I thought, there was a lot of coordination, not just being a pilot, just, the logistics of coordinating that effort to form the Air Force. Obviously, there was,
Yeah, that was not his involvement. He was actually in the 56 war, the Sinai War. He was in logistics, Army logistics. Everyone served in the Army in the 40s, 50s, but he was not a pilot.
Okay, and finally, did you do any research on your family or vestige of your family left over in Bialystok? Did you ever go there or do any research?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to give credit to my sister. She researched genealogy. She still does it. She hired a journalist, Tomas, very well regarded. He's printed books about Bialystok Jewry. So the short answer is she's done most of that work. In the back of this book, I do talk about what I know about about the 4 people in my father's family, as well as all my first cousins on my father's side. But I mean, she has a genealogy table that goes back a couple hundred years. I don't want to like make it too thick.
Yeah, sure, okay.
Please.
Where did your parents live in their later years?
It's a great question. So, my parents moved from North Tel Aviv, where my dad lived, before he met my mom. In 1952, they moved to Ramat HaSharon. Ramat HaSharon was an agricultural town founded by the Poles and the Polish immigrants in 1929. It was, when they moved there, it was about 900 citizens. Today it's about 60,000. It's crazy. And that's where I grew up. That's our house. And I talk about this in this book. Again, I will tell you, our house we grew up in was the only Bauhaus style house in all of Ramat HaSharon. You know, Tel Aviv is mostly Bauhaus in the old school. But I got a random call, an email, from 2 master students at Tel Aviv University who wanted to write a dissertation about my house. And they wrote a dissertation. They published it as their master dissertation. It's like over 200 pages long, and they interviewed me, and I gave them some sources. Anyway, they moved there, and then in 1981, they moved to Herzliya Pituach. My dad loved the ocean, so he moved to Herzliya Pituach. They bought a nice house there. And in the last year of his life, they moved to Bet Potea, which is near Netanya. It's an assisted living facility. My dad passed away in the winter of 2003, and my mom passed away in 2007. But thank you for asking a good question.
Is your father buried in Har Herzl?
He's not. Both my parents are buried in Kibbutz Givat HaShosha, which is a kibbutz very close to where he worked in the orange groves, and it's particularly appreciated by artists, sculptors, and literary writers. So we thought that would be a better place to be than some random place. It's a beautiful cemetery, I have to tell you. On this side? No? All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure, fascinating, and as I said, the books are here. We may move them to the back table because there's going to be an extended beer cut on the so if people want to take advantage of book signing and purchase, I think you should probably have that. Right now,
Thank you very much. I'm just going to take a minute to thank all the men that helped cook. Stephen and Barbara Marks, the wonderful duo. Mitch Rothman. So Barbara and Mitchell were our LACA leaders. And LACA would not have been possible without them. Roy Cardon, not only is he man of the year, but he's also a phenomenal helper in the kitchen. Lee Tavis, Bill Wankoff, Barry Cohen, Bob Weiss, Stan Weintraub, and the guy for whom the whole day really pivots upon is Rob Zipkin, between getting the speaker and reminding me every couple days that there are more steps that need to be done. It's not going to do itself. So thank you, Rob.